Let's compare our three notions of consumer welfare: consumer surplus, compensating variation, and equivalent variation. First of all, which one's going to be bigger? Well, it depends on the income elasticity. For normal goods, the compensating variation is going to be bigger than the change in consumer surplus, and the change in consumer surplus is going to be bigger than the equivalent variation. So they're going to be ordered in that: consumer variation bigger than change in consumer surplus, bigger than equivalent variation. For inferior goods, that order is going to be reversed. Equivalent variation is going to be the biggest, consumer surplus change is going to be second biggest, and the compensating variation is going to be the smallest. So let's see this in a little more detail. We're not going to do the math, but we'll do this graphically. So let's first draw the demand curve. So this is the demand curve for the consumer. And let's contemplate an increase to the price from P1 to P1 prime. That's going to be associated with a decrease in the consumption from Q1 to Q1 prime. We're just going to follow the demand curve from here to here. Just erase that. Now the consumer surplus change is going to be just this area B plus this area A. So it's remember, it's going to be the consumer surplus before the change is, if this were the demand curve, it's all of this area below the demand curve above the price. Consumer surplus after the change is going to be this area. So the change in consumer surplus is going to just be that part. It's going to be this area over here, right? So it's the area below the demand curve between the two prices. That's going to be the change in consumer surplus from having P1 rise to P1 prime. So if we subtract the consumer surplus after the change from the consumer surplus before the change, this is what we're going to get, this area here. What about the compensating variation? Remember, we're going to compensate the consumer to get them back to the original utility level. The original utility level is the utility they get when they are at this bundle, at the bundle where they consume Q1 units of the good and the price was P1. So since we're compensating them to stay at that utility level, what we're going to do is actually look at and I'm going to skip the math here. We're not going to do the math for this course, but it turns out that the compensating variation is going to be given by the area under the Hicksian demand, or the compensated demand, at the utility level that they originally were at. So the compensating variation is going to be the area A plus B plus C. So it's all of this area. Finally, for the equivalent variation, by similar reasoning, we're fixing the reference utility to be the utility at the bundle Q1 prime Q2 prime, the utility that they get after the price increases to P1 prime. So the Hicksian demand is at that utility level is going to cross this point right here. And the equivalent variation is the area between the two prices below that demand curve. So it's going to be just this area A. So graphically, we can see here then that the compensating variation is areas A, B, and C. Change in consumer surplus is areas A and B, whereas equivalent variation is only area A. That tells us the order of these these three measures of welfare. So that's why we have that the compensating variation is greater in magnitude than the change in consumer surplus, and the change in consumer surplus is greater in magnitude than the equivalent variation. Now you might wonder why this would change for inferior goods, and the answer is because for inferior goods, the uncompensated demand is actually going to be steeper than the Hicksian demand. So the uncompensated demand is steeper than the compensated demand, which is the reverse of what we see for the normal goods on the picture that we just saw on the previous slide. And that's what is going to reverse the relationship between these three measures. In general, these areas B and C that we saw are going to be very small compared to A. So it often doesn't matter which of the three measures you use for practical purposes. So economists typically like to use consumer surplus because it's easy to calculate from observable data. Expenditure functions and utility functions aren't exactly observable, but demand functions are. So you can actually calculate a change in consumer surplus, whereas estimating the compensating or equivalent variation is trickier.